Why do so many of today's global conflicts trace their origins to lines drawn on a map over a century ago? The answer often leads back to the British Empire and its role in shaping the world's borders, sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes strategically, but almost always with lasting, often devastating consequences. At its peak, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, with territories spanning across every inhabited continent. Its influence on the world was profound, shaping everything from trade and culture to language and governance. However, one of the most enduring legacies of the British Empire is the modern borders it left behind. Borders that continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of today's world. The process of empire building involved not just the acquisition of land, but also the imposition of new borders. Often, these borders were drawn with little regard for the ethnic, religious, and cultural complexities of the regions involved. The priority was often strategic, focused on controlling resources, facilitating trade, or simply exerting dominance. The result was a patchwork of states and territories whose borders frequently ignored the realities on the ground, sowing the seeds for future conflict. The legacy of British colonialism is perhaps most evident in Africa, where the infamous Scramble for Africa saw European powers, including Britain, carve up the continent with little consideration for the existing ethnic and political landscapes. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85, which was convened to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, is a glaring example of this. At the conference, European powers, with Britain playing a significant role, divided Africa into territories based on their interests, rather than the continent's complex patchwork of ethnic groups, languages, and cultures. The borders that emerged from this process were often arbitrary, cutting across ethnic and cultural lines. In some cases, rival groups were forced into the same state, while in others, communities that had historically lived together were separated. Nigeria, for instance, was created by merging numerous ethnic groups, including the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the southwest, and the Igbo in the southeast. These groups had their own distinct cultures, languages, and systems of governance, yet they were all lumped together into one colony for the convenience of British administration. The tensions that arose from this forced union have persisted into the present, contributing to the Nigerian Civil War in 1967 to 1970 and ongoing ethnic and religious conflicts. Another striking example is the Middle East, where the borders drawn by the British and French following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I have had far-reaching consequences. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret deal between Britain and France, divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence. The lines drawn by Sykes-Picot disregarded the region's complex mosaic of ethnicities, sects, and tribes, leading to the creation of states like Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, whose borders often bore little relation to the realities on the ground. In Iraq, for example, the British combined three Ottoman provinces, Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south, into a single state. These provinces were home to distinct groups: Kurds in the north, Sunni Arabs in the center, and Shia Arabs in the south. The creation of Iraq as a unified state under British rule set the stage for decades of internal conflict, as these groups struggled for power in a country where the borders were imposed rather than organically developed. Similarly, the creation of Israel and the partition of Palestine, influenced heavily by British policies, laid the groundwork for one of the most enduring and intractable conflicts of the modern era. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and the subsequent British mandate in Palestine, set in motion a series of events that led to the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. The borders that were drawn and the conflicting promises made by the British to both Jews and Arabs have fueled a conflict that remains unresolved to this day. One of the most significant and traumatic consequences of British-imposed borders was the partition of India in 1947. As British rule in India drew to a close, the decision was made to divide the subcontinent into two independent states, India and Pakistan. This partition was based primarily on religious lines, with India intended as a Hindu majority state and Pakistan as a Muslim majority state. However, the borders drawn by the British were done hastily and with little regard for the complex realities on the ground. The Radcliffe Line, named after the British lawyer Cyril Radcliffe, who was tasked with demarcating the borders, cut through provinces, districts, and even villages, dividing communities that had lived together for centuries. The result was one of the largest mass migrations in history, as millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs fled across the new borders to escape communal violence. An estimated 1 to 2 million people died in the ensuing violence, and the legacy of partition continues to haunt the region, contributing to the ongoing conflict between India and Pakistan, particularly over the disputed region of Kashmir. The Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East serves as another climax in the story of British imperial border making. The arbitrary borders it created have been a source of conflict ever since. In Iraq, the artificial borders contributed to sectarian tensions that exploded after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, leading to a civil war that has devastated the country. In Syria, the borders drawn by Sykes-Picot have contributed to the country's ongoing civil war, which began in 2011 and has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of refugees. The rise of groups like ISIS, which sought to erase the borders created by Sykes-Picot and establish a caliphate, can also be tracked back to the legacies of these colonial decisions. The aftermath of British colonial border making has been marked by a series of conflicts and struggles, as newly independent nations have grappled with the legacies of their colonial pasts. In Africa, the arbitrary borders created by the British and other colonial powers have been a source of conflict since independence. In some cases, these borders have led to civil wars, as different ethnic groups have fought for control of the state. In other cases, they have led to secessionist movements, as groups have sought to create their own states along more ethnically or culturally homogeneous lines. In Nigeria, for example, the Biafran War of 1967 to 1970 was a direct result of the tensions created by British-imposed borders. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, feeling marginalized and threatened by the dominant Hausa Fulani in the north, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. The resulting civil war claimed the lives of an estimated 1 to 3 million people, mostly due to famine and disease, and left deep scars that continue to affect Nigeria's politics and society. In the Middle East, the borders drawn by the British and other colonial powers have contributed to a series of conflicts, from the Arab-Israeli wars to the ongoing civil wars in Iraq and Syria. The creation of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians has led to decades of conflict, with no resolution in sight. In Iraq and Syria, the artificial borders have contributed to sectarian tensions that have erupted into violence, leading to the rise of extremist groups and the destabilization of the entire region. The legacy of British colonialism is also evident in South Asia, where the partition of India continues to influence the region's politics and security. The conflict over Kashmir, which began in 1947 and has led to several wars between India and Pakistan, is a direct result of the partition and the ambiguous borders left by the British. The rivalry between India and Pakistan, both now nuclear-armed states, remains one of the most dangerous in the world, with the potential to escalate into a full-scale war with devastating consequences. The historical actions of the British Empire, particularly its role in creating modern borders, continue to influence global relations and conflicts today. The borders drawn by the British were often arbitrary, based on strategic interests rather than the realities on the ground. These borders have led to a series of conflicts as newly independent nations have struggled to manage the legacies of colonialism. Understanding the history of these borders is crucial for understanding many of today's global conflicts. The seeds of many of these conflicts were sown during the colonial period, when borders were drawn without regard for the people who lived there. The legacy of these decisions continues to shape the world, influencing everything from local politics to international relations. While the British Empire is long gone, its legacy lives on in the borders it created and the conflicts that have arisen from them. Recognizing and understanding this history is essential for finding ways to resolve these conflicts and move towards a more peaceful and just world. What do you think about the role of the British Empire in shaping modern borders and conflicts? Share your thoughts in the comments below.